The conference hall was packed, voices overlapping beneath the constant hum of music and polite laughter. Mark Ellison stood near the edge of the crowd, holding a paper cup of coffee he had already forgotten to drink. Events like this drained him, but visibility mattered, especially now. He scanned the room more out of habit than interest, alert in the way single parents learn to be, always half watching, half calculating, even in places that were supposed to feel safe. Near the center of the room, something shifted. A raised voice cut through the noise, sharp and impatient. Mark noticed it before most people did, perhaps because escalation felt familiar to him. A small cluster formed around a woman arguing with venue staff. Their faces tight, movements stiff. Others glanced over, then looked away, choosing discomfort over involvement. Mark hesitated only a second before moving closer. The issue itself was mundane. A technical failure, a schedule slipping, a misunderstanding growing louder by the minute. The woman's frustration was controlled but intense, and the staff member looked overwhelmed. Trapped between rules and pressure, Mark stepped in quietly, not to take sides, but to slow things down. He asked simple questions, reframed what was being said, lowered the temperature without raising his voice. He positioned himself slightly between them, not blocking, just grounding the exchange. Years of navigating tense conversations had taught him that tone mattered more than authority. He acknowledged the problem without assigning blame, suggested a temporary solution, offered to help coordinate while they waited. The argument lost momentum. Voices dropped. The small crowd began to disperse, interest fading as resolution replaced spectacle. The woman exhaled, tension easing from her shoulders. She nodded once, a brief acknowledgement, then turned back to the staff member to finish the discussion calmly. No one applauded, no one thanked Mark directly. That was fine. He stepped back into the crowd, satisfied that the situation hadn't become something worse. To him, it was just another moment managed, another quiet intervention. He didn't connect her face to anything specific at first. She was well-dressed, composed, clearly important to the event, but importance was relative in rooms like this. Mark returned to his place near the wall, checking his phone, thinking about how late he could stay before needing to get home. The incident already felt distant, filed away as something handled. Only later, as the event progressed, did he hear her name mentioned in passing. A ripple of respect followed it, subtle but unmistakable. Board member, CEO, decision-maker. The words landed slowly, rearranging his understanding of the moment. He looked across the room again, spotting her in conversation, surrounded now by deference instead of tension. A quiet realization settled in his chest. The woman he had helped without thinking carried influence far beyond that brief exchange. His action had been small, human, almost invisible, but context had weight. And as Mark watched how others responded to her presence, he understood that the moment he had stepped into, unclaimed by anyone else, might not remain as simple as it had seemed. The crowd thinned gradually, conversations breaking apart as people drifted toward exits or quieter corners. Mark remained near the edge of the hall, waiting for the right moment to leave without drawing attention. That was when he noticed her standing alone near the stage. Posture still composed, but no longer rigid. The tension he had seen earlier hadn't vanished. It had settled. She caught his eye and walked over, movements measured, as if choosing her timing carefully. Up close, the polish softened. "Thank you," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Claire Whitman." Her voice was calm, but there was a faint strain beneath it, something held in check. Mark introduced himself simply, shaking her hand with a firmness that matched her own. The exchange was professional, almost formal, yet the energy between them felt unsettled, as if the moment they shared hadn't fully concluded. She glanced briefly toward the now empty space where the argument had unfolded. "That could have gone badly," she added, not quite meeting his eyes. Gratitude was there, unmistakable, but it was layered. Mark sensed it immediately. The way her words carried relief, but also awareness. She wasn't just thanking him, she was recalculating what his presence had changed. It wasn't a big thing, Mark replied, instinctively downplaying his role. He had learned long ago that drawing attention to himself rarely ended well. Still, he noticed how carefully she studied him now, as if fitting him into a larger picture. Her expression wasn't suspicious, but it wasn't casual either. It was focused, deliberate. For a brief second, her composure cracked, just enough for him to see exhaustion beneath the authority, the kind that came from constant decision-making, from carrying outcomes that affected more than oneself. She inhaled slowly, regaining control, and nodded as if the moment had passed. But Mark had already seen it, and he sensed she knew that he had. "People tend to hesitate," she said quietly, almost to herself. "You didn't." The statement felt observational rather than complimentary. Mark shrugged slightly, unsure how to respond. He hadn't acted out of courage or principle, just habit. Problems escalated when no one intervened. He'd seen that pattern too many times. A pause stretched between them, not awkward but unfinished. The distance that should have reasserted itself after thanks remained suspended. He felt it in the way she lingered, in how her questions stopped short of being asked. Whatever calculation was happening, it hadn't reached a conclusion yet. Finally, she stepped back, offering a polite smile that restored the familiar hierarchy. "I won't keep you," she said, already preparing to move on. Mark nodded, relieved and unsettled at the same time. As she walked away, surrounded once again by quiet deference, he understood that the moment hadn't ended, it had simply shifted. The space between them wasn't closed. It was waiting. Claire didn't recognize him immediately for who he was beyond the moment. But later that evening, standing alone with her phone glowing in her hand, the pieces aligned. A name surfaced, attached to a brief report she had skimmed days earlier. Mark Rivera, single parent, loan application flagged for expedited review due to time sensitivity. The face from the file and the man from the crowd merged, and the realization tightened her jaw. The encounter no longer lived in isolation. When she saw him again near the exit, her tone shifted almost imperceptibly. "Mark," she said this time, not asking, confirming. He paused, surprised she remembered. That single word reframed everything. He felt it immediately, the subtle relocation of power. What had been a shared human moment now sat inside a structure he hadn't chosen to enter. Her awareness changed the weight of his earlier help. She spoke carefully, as if every sentence now carried legal mass. "I didn't place you at first," she admitted, "but I rarely forget a name attached to urgency." The implication lingered between them. Mark's relief from earlier resurfaced as unease. He had stepped in as a person, not a profile. Yet here he was, reduced back into context, numbers, approvals, discretion. He tried to steady the conversation, grounding it. "What happened earlier had nothing to do with that," he said. His voice remained calm, but inside something tightened. Claire nodded slowly, acknowledging the distinction while quietly dissolving it. "Of course," she replied. "But situations don't stay separate once they intersect." Her honesty was unsettling precisely because it wasn't threatening. For the first time, Mark sensed consequences extending beyond his control. The help he'd offered wasn't being misinterpreted, but it was being absorbed, folded into a narrative that included leverage, access, and unspoken awareness. He hadn't agreed to that story, yet it was forming anyway, shaped by her position and his vulnerability. Claire's expression softened, though her eyes stayed sharp. "I want you to know," she said, lowering her voice, "that I value discretion." The word landed heavier than any request. Not a demand, not an exchange, just a recalibration of reality. Mark nodded slowly, feeling the ground shift beneath a moment that had once felt clean. He realized then that recognition wasn't neutral. Being seen by someone with authority didn't clarify, it complicated. His action, once simple, now carried implied intent he never had. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was dense, filled with paths, neither of them named aloud. As they parted again, Mark understood that the story had changed shape. What he had done still mattered, but not on his terms. The help was no longer just help, it was context. And context, once claimed by power, rarely stayed harmless. Claire reached out 2 days later, the timing precise enough to feel intentional without appearing planned. The message was short, polite, and framed as gratitude. She thanked him again for stepping in when no one else had, then mentioned a quiet lunch near her office. "Just to acknowledge what you did," she wrote. "No pressure, no urgency." Mark stared at the screen longer than he meant to. The words were ordinary, but the context made them heavy. An invitation from someone like her never existed in a vacuum. He told himself it was harmless. People thanked each other all the time. Yet this wasn't a co-worker or a neighbor. It was Claire, a CEO whose signature carried weight over decisions that shaped lives, including his. Accepting felt like crossing an invisible line. Declining felt like rejecting goodwill he might need later. He typed a response, erased it, then typed again. Every version sounded wrong, either too eager or unnecessarily distant. They met at a cafe chosen for its neutrality. No exclusivity, no spectacle. Claire arrived alone, dressed simply, blending in despite the authority she carried. She smiled easily, disarming without effort. "I didn't want this to feel formal," she said, as if reading his thoughts. Mark nodded, though his body stayed tense. He noticed how carefully she positioned the meeting as casual, how nothing about it could be misread on the surface. Conversation stayed light at first, work in broad strokes, the city, small inconveniences. But beneath it all, Mark felt a quiet recalibration happening. Her courtesy wasn't empty, it was deliberate. Every question she asked revealed interest without intimacy, attention without vulnerability. He realized she was skilled at this, at creating comfort without surrendering control. The imbalance didn't announce itself, it settled in slowly. At one point, Claire leaned back and said, "I believe in acknowledging people who act without self-interest." The statement sounded like praise, yet it carried an undertone Mark couldn't ignore. It suggested standards, expectations. He wondered whether the meeting was truly about gratitude, or about assessing him, his discretion, his temperament, his reliability. The thought unsettled him more than any overt demand would have. He spoke carefully, keeping his answers grounded, personal, but not revealing. He mentioned his son, his schedule, the realities that shaped his days. Claire listened intently, absorbing details without commenting on their relevance. That silence made him uneasy. He couldn't tell which parts of himself were being noted simply as human context, and which might be stored away for future leverage. When the check came, Claire paid without asking. "Please," she said softly when he reached for his wallet. "This one's on me." It was a small gesture, almost trivial, yet Mark felt the subtle shift it created. Acceptance wasn't about money, it was about allowance. Letting her define the terms of the interaction. He thanked her, aware that even courtesy could establish precedent. As they stood to leave, Claire touched his arm briefly, the contact light but intentional. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I hope we can keep things open." The word lingered after they parted. Mark walked away with the sense that something had been offered without being named. Not a deal, not a request, just a door held open politely, but with consequences attached to whichever choice he made next. That night, the apartment felt smaller than usual. Mark moved through the narrow hallway quietly, careful not to wake his son. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the soft glow from the kitchen light, all of it pressed in on him. Responsibility wasn't an abstract idea here. It lived in overdue notices tucked into a drawer, in the calendar marked with school fees, in the way he measured groceries down to the last dollar. Every choice he made echoed beyond himself. Lucas was asleep, one arm thrown over a pillow, breathing slow and even. Mark paused at the doorway longer than necessary. This was the center of every calculation he made. Stability wasn't about ambition or comfort. It was about continuity. Same school, same neighborhood, same sense that tomorrow wouldn't collapse unexpectedly. The loan approval had felt like oxygen. Without it, everything narrowed again, became fragile. Claire's presence now hovered over that relief, complicating it. At the kitchen table, Mark opened his laptop and reviewed his budget for the third time that week. The numbers didn't change, but his perception of them did. What Claire could offer, directly or indirectly, wasn't theoretical. Access smoothed obstacles, influence shortened timelines. One call from her could erase months of strain. That knowledge sat heavy in his chest, not because he wanted to use it, but because he couldn't unlearn it. He replayed their lunch in his mind, searching for hidden clauses. Nothing explicit had been said, no demands, no promises, yet the subtext lingered. Courtesy layered over power always came with conditions, even unspoken ones. Mark wondered whether refusing future contact would quietly mark him as ungrateful, or worse, uncooperative. He hated that such thoughts even existed. He'd built his life on clean lines, clear effort, earned outcomes. Lucas stirred and mumbled in his sleep. Mark closed the laptop and rubbed his face, exhaustion catching up with him. Being a single father meant absorbing uncertainty without letting it show. There was no backup plan, no second income, no one else to absorb the risk. Any mistake landed directly on his son's life. That reality sharpened every moral question into something painfully practical. Claire hadn't asked for anything yet. That was the problem. The absence of a price made the offer more dangerous, not less. Mark knew how favors worked in theory. In practice, they unfolded slowly, reshaping boundaries until refusal felt impossible. He wondered if accepting her attention already counted as the first step. If the door he'd walked through at lunch couldn't be closed without consequence. He moved to the fridge, taped a drawing Lucas had brought home from school back into place. Crayon lines, uneven letters spelling his name. This was the contract Mark had already signed, with no exit clause. Protecting this meant sometimes swallowing pride, sometimes choosing the least damaging option rather than the purest one. That truth settled into him with quiet force. Mark sat back down and stared at his phone, unopened messages glowing faintly. He understood now that responsibility wasn't just about providing, it was about deciding which risks were survivable. Claire's influence could solve immediate problems. It could also introduce a different kind of instability, one that crept in disguised as help. He didn't yet know the cost, but he felt with unsettling clarity that payment would be required eventually. The shift didn't announce itself with a request. It arrived quietly, folded into convenience. An email from the bank moved faster than expected. A document previously flagged was suddenly cleared. Mark noticed the timing immediately. He hadn't followed up, he hadn't pushed, yet things were resolving themselves. Relief came first, then suspicion. Help that arrived unprompted carried fingerprints, even when no one claimed ownership. Claire didn't mention it directly when they spoke again. She never needed to. "I'm glad things are moving on your end," she said casually during a brief call, her tone light, almost friendly. Mark thanked her without confirming anything. The exchange stayed polite, professional. Still, when the call ended, the air felt different. Support had entered the room, and it hadn't come empty-handed. Soon after, small signals followed. A text checking in at the end of the day, a comment about availability, questions framed as concern, but timed too precisely to be coincidence. None of it crossed a clear line. That was the point. Each gesture stood alone as reasonable, deniable. Together, they formed a pattern Mark couldn't ignore. The help was no longer reactive, it was anticipatory. He began to understand the architecture beneath it. Claire didn't need to demand anything. Her position did the work for her. Influence created gravity. The closer he moved to its center, the harder it became to step away without effort. What had started as a single act of kindness now existed inside a system, one she navigated instinctively, one he had never agreed to enter. Mark caught himself editing his behavior. Delaying responses felt risky. Declining invitations required explanation. He hated the way his instincts recalibrated around her presence. The leverage wasn't about control, it was about awareness. She knew what mattered to him. She knew where pressure lived, and she never had to name it for it to be effective. At home, Lucas asked if the move was still happening. The question landed harder than any message from Claire. Mark answered carefully, promising what he wasn't fully sure he could deliver. Stability had started to feel conditional again, dependent not just on effort, but on alignment. That realization tightened something in his chest. He'd escaped instability once. He hadn't expected it to return wearing a courteous smile. Claire remained composed, generous, publicly distant. That restraint made resistance harder, not easier. There was no villain to push against, no overt threat to reject, only a current that pulled gently, persistently toward obligation. Mark recognized it from stories he'd heard, situations he'd sworn he'd never be part of. Yet here he was, calculating silence like currency. He understood then that the dynamic had changed permanently. This wasn't about gratitude anymore. It was about structure, about how power arranged itself around vulnerability. The help had solved problems, yes, but it had also rewritten the terms under which solutions arrived. Mark felt the weight settle fully now, not fear, not anger, just the sober knowledge that leverage, once established, rarely dissolved on its own. Mark began to notice how quiet had become his default response. He didn't object, he didn't clarify. He let conversations end without questions, letting pauses do the work for him. At first it felt strategic, temporary, even wise, but silence had a way of settling into permanence. The longer he said nothing, the more it resembled consent. Not explicit, not enthusiastic, but sufficient. The terms were forming anyway, shaped by absence rather than intention. He replayed recent exchanges and saw what he'd avoided naming. He hadn't pushed back when Claire assumed availability. He hadn't corrected her when she spoke, as if certain outcomes were understood. Each moment felt too small to challenge on its own. Together, they outlined a boundary he had never drawn. Mark realized that power didn't need confrontation to expand. It only needed space. The thought unsettled him deeply. He'd always believed restraint was a form of control. Now it felt like surrender. By choosing not to define limits, he'd allowed them to be defined for him. That realization carried its own kind of shame, not because he'd done something wrong, but because he'd recognized himself drifting away from the man he believed he was, the one who acted deliberately, the one who chose. At home, the consequences echoed quietly. He found himself distracted during dinner, responses delayed, patience thinner than usual. Lucas noticed. Children always did. "Are we okay?" his son asked, not accusing, just curious. Mark forced a smile and said yes, knowing the answer was more complicated. He wondered what kind of stability he was modeling. Security bought through silence, comfort maintained through compliance. That night he sat alone and tried to name his limits honestly. What would he refuse, even if it cost him? Where did practicality end and compromise begin? The answers weren't clean. Responsibility blurred them. Fear softened edges he once thought were firm. Still, the exercise mattered. A line not drawn could always be crossed. A line named, even privately, still existed. Mark understood now that doing nothing was not neutral. It was participatory. Every unanswered implication reinforced the structure forming around him. Claire didn't need to escalate. The system worked as long as he remained quiet. That clarity stripped away his excuses. Waiting was no longer a passive state. It was a choice with direction. He felt the weight of that choice settle in his body, heavy but clarifying. Silence had protected him from immediate conflict, but it was costing him agency. The longer he delayed, the harder it would be to speak without disruption. He didn't yet know what action looked like, but he knew, with growing certainty, that remaining undefined was no longer an option. For the first time since the moment everything shifted, Mark felt the edges of resolve returning. Not confidence, not certainty, just a refusal to keep drifting. He had allowed the line to remain invisible for too long. Now he could feel it pressing against him, demanding acknowledgement. Whatever came next, it would have to be chosen, not assumed. Mark chose his moment deliberately, not when pressure peaked, but when it felt deceptively calm. He didn't accuse or dramatize, he simply clarified. In a measured message, he thanked Claire for her support, then stated plainly that he needed their interactions to return to clear professional boundaries. No ambiguity, no apology for wanting it. As soon as he sent it, a quiet dread settled in. He knew restraint could be misread as ingratitude and clarity as defiance. The risk wasn't abstract anymore, it was immediate, personal, and irreversible. The response didn't come right away. That silence felt heavier than any sharp reply would have. Mark's mind filled the gap with consequences, delayed paperwork, quiet resistance, opportunities dissolving without explanation. He reminded himself that this was the cost of drawing a line. Power rarely reacted loudly when challenged. It adjusted subtly. He checked his phone too often, aware of the irony. The moment he reclaimed his agency, he felt more exposed than ever. When Claire finally replied, her tone was calm, almost courteous. She acknowledged his message, said she respected clarity, and agreed that professionalism mattered. On the surface, it was exactly what he'd hoped for. Beneath it, something colder settled. The warmth was gone. The familiarity dissolved. Mark recognized the shift instantly. He hadn't been punished, but he'd been repositioned. Distance, he realized, was its own form of consequence. At work, the effects surfaced quickly. A meeting he'd expected to attend was reassigned. A follow-up stalled without explanation, nothing overt, nothing he could point to, just friction where there had been ease. Mark absorbed it quietly, reminding himself why he'd chosen this path. Opportunity lost its shine when it demanded erosion. Still, the doubt crept in. He wondered if pride had outweighed practicality. At home, the tension followed him. Lucas asked again about timelines, about certainty. Mark answered honestly this time, without promises he couldn't guarantee. It hurt more than silence ever had. Yet something steadied in him as he spoke. Fear hadn't disappeared, but it no longer dictated his words. That mattered. Stability built on truth, even fragile truth, felt different than comfort bought through avoidance. Late that night, Mark sat alone and examined the loss he feared. It wasn't the loan, it wasn't access or favor. It was the slow distortion of self, becoming someone who navigated life by implication rather than principle. He understood now that safety without alignment was just another kind of risk, one that accumulated quietly until it demanded repayment. The cost of pushing back was real, and it would continue to reveal itself over time. But for the first time in weeks, Mark slept without the weight of unspoken agreement pressing on his chest. The uncertainty remained. The outcome was unclear. Yet the path felt his again. And that reclamation, fragile as it was, mattered more than any advantage he might have preserved by staying silent. He knew the story wouldn't resolve cleanly. Power rarely conceded, and life rarely rewarded integrity immediately. But as he lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of his apartment, Mark felt something return that he hadn't noticed slipping away. Not confidence, not control, just recognition. He hadn't won, but he hadn't disappeared either. And for now, that was enough. Claire's response didn't arrive as punishment or reassurance. It arrived as restraint. No follow-up messages, no pointed reminders, no sudden generosity to soften the distance. The absence itself was intentional, and Mark felt it immediately. He had prepared for resistance or subtle retaliation, but this was different. The system hadn't pushed back, it had adjusted. Power didn't disappear. It simply rearranged itself out of sight. Days passed with professional normalcy that felt almost artificial. Emails were concise, meetings were efficient. Decisions moved forward at a reasonable pace, neither stalled nor accelerated. On paper, nothing had changed. In practice, everything had. Mark sensed a new perimeter around their interaction, one defined entirely by her choice to step back. That choice unsettled him more than pressure ever had, because it confirmed how optional his position truly was. When they crossed paths again, it was brief and public. Claire nodded politely, acknowledging him without warmth or hostility. The gesture was controlled, deliberate. It communicated closure without finality. Mark realized then that restraint was not neutrality. It was authority exercised quietly. She didn't need to remind him of her reach. The fact that she could disengage so cleanly was the reminder. He wrestled with the ambiguity more than he had with overt leverage. Conflict at least created edges, something to resist or negotiate. This recalibration offered no clear opponent, no injustice to name, just a reality where access had been withdrawn without explanation. Mark wondered if this was the true shape of power, flexible enough to appear reasonable, distant enough to remain untouchable. At home, the uncertainty echoed differently now. The loan process continued, slower but intact. Nothing collapsed, nothing improved. Stability remained provisional. Mark realized that restraint preserved her authority while denying him clarity. He couldn't claim harm, but he couldn't claim safety either. The balance hovered, unresolved and unspoken. What unsettled him most was recognizing that this outcome wasn't about him at all. Claire hadn't reacted emotionally because she didn't need to. The recalibration wasn't personal, it was structural. He had stepped out of alignment, and the system had quietly compensated. No drama, no correction, just adjustment. That understanding stripped away the illusion that his choice had shifted the hierarchy. Still, Mark felt a strange sense of relief threaded through the discomfort. The absence of retaliation confirmed that his boundary hadn't been punished. It had simply been accepted as a limitation. That didn't make things fair, but it made them honest. He could now see the space he occupied clearly, without the distortion of implied favor. Power, he realized, didn't always resolve into winners and losers. Sometimes it settled into distance, into parallel paths that no longer touched. As Mark moved forward, he carried that clarity with him. The situation wasn't over, it might never be, but it had changed shape again, quieter, colder, and more truthful than before. Life didn't reorganize itself after that. Bills still arrived on schedule. Mornings were still rushed. Lucas still needed rides, lunches, reassurance. The loan finalized weeks later, without ceremony, without special acceleration. It wasn't a victory or a loss, just an outcome. Mark noticed that relief came quieter this time. Not because it mattered less, but because it no longer defined him. The pressure remained, but it no longer dictated his posture toward the world. Work settled into a narrower lane, fewer shortcuts, less access, more predictability. Mark adjusted. He worked longer hours, recalculated timelines, accepted limits he couldn't bend. It was harder in some ways, but cleaner. He no longer scanned messages for implication or weighed tone for hidden cost. The absence of that mental labor freed something he hadn't realized was exhausted. Clarity replaced vigilance, and that shift mattered more than convenience. At home, the changes were subtle, but real. Mark spoke more honestly, especially with himself. When Lucas asked questions, the answers weren't padded with optimism or fear. They were measured, grounded. Stability wasn't promised. It was pursued. The difference showed in small moments, fewer late-night spirals, steadier routines, patience that didn't feel forced. The future still felt uncertain, but it no longer felt conditional on silence. Mark reflected often on what he'd almost traded without naming it. Survival had tempted him to confuse endurance with compliance. He understood now how easily necessity could justify erasure. The system hadn't asked him to disappear, but it would have allowed it. That realization stayed with him, not as bitterness, but as warning. He had learned how power invited submission without demanding it. Claire faded into the background of his life, not erased but contextualized. She remained influential, untouchable, but no longer central. Mark didn't frame her as antagonist or benefactor. She was simply a reminder of how quickly roles could be assigned when vulnerability met authority. He carried that lesson forward, attentive now to moments when ease came with invisible strings. Circumstances improved slowly, unevenly. Some doors stayed closed, others opened through effort alone. Progress felt earned again, and that restored something fundamental. Mark no longer measured success by speed or relief, but by alignment. The absence of shortcuts made him tired, but it also made him present. Each step forward belonged to him. What changed most wasn't his situation, it was his orientation. He stopped mistaking fear for pragmatism, stopped calling avoidance wisdom. Agency didn't eliminate risk, but it clarified it. He could now choose which costs were acceptable and which weren't. That distinction grounded him in a way no favor ever could. Mark understood that survival would always require compromise, but submission was optional. The difference wasn't loud or dramatic. It was internal, steady, and enduring. His life hadn't been rescued. It had been reclaimed, and that reclamation, quiet and unresolved as it was, marked the true ending of the story.